Hey everyone, welcome back to AZ Update episode number 9. Welcome back to the show. My name is Anthony Bartolo, Senior Cloud Advocate with Microsoft, and your host and co-hosted by
Thomas Maurer.
Thomas. How's it going, sir?
Good. As always, enjoying a little bit of the weather in Switzerland. We have very mixed up stuff. Sometimes sun, sometimes rain. It changes now every hour. So really enjoying that. And then obviously a lot of things going on this week, as you know. So that's why we're here to cover that.
Yep, and we're in a day early, so we're just testing out new times to see, in terms of our audience and where they're at. Interesting to start really quickly. There's been a lot of celebrations that have been occurring. School year's upon us; it's almost done, and there's a lot of graduations happening. I've got a nephew in grade 8 who just graduated. There's a lot of university and college graduations that are going on. I know producer Pierre is very proud of his daughter, just graduated from university out in Ottawa. And what's been interesting is in current times of the human malware that's happening, a lot of people are doing digitalized graduation ceremonies. And so, we're seeing this adoption of technology in such a way where it's connecting people together in respect to, those college grads and celebrating the amount of work that they've done to really acknowledge that through digital technology.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that is some of the videos I think we the Azure team and the Teams team shared this week out, which is very interesting to watch, to see, hey, what do we actually enable? I think, if I remember correctly, there's some free services we enable for exactly these scenarios and for universities with live events where they can host up for a couple of thousand people. And yeah, there's an interesting session out there from Mark Rusinovich, a presentation about Microsoft's response to those difficult times we're just having where we are, and what we did to meet the demand for our customers, how we reacted to the situation, how we help our customers, as for example with Microsoft Teams and giving away Teams for universities and stuff like that. And he also goes through, for me, even more interesting, goes a little bit through what happened and how this pandemic have an impact on Azure, right? On Azure services. And he shared a couple of numbers. And one thing which just blows me away is when they saw that certain lockdowns happen in a region, like when they started in January 23 in Wuhan or March 9 in Italy, they saw the peak traffic grow in Azure WAN connectivity up to 40 times more than usual. 40 times, and that's insane. And then they also told that, but this also added obviously more cybersecurity risk and more attacks. So they also saw an increase of DDoS attacks by 50%. So all these numbers are just super interesting, and he shares a lot of these numbers, and then also what the teams did to help meeting our customer demand, right? Improving our technology, optimizing where we can to get more demand and get more CPU cores back for our customers, and do some very smart things where obviously when a region starts working, because you can see the peaks when people in the morning log in versus when obviously there's a night. So shifting resources to different regions depending on the time. So it's super interesting session to watch.
Yeah, what I find interesting is the use of machine learning to understand usage patterns in terms of how resources are allocated, so that they know that there's going to be a spike at a certain time in Australia as opposed to India or as opposed to the United States. There is that availability of dedicating the resources in an automated fashion, understanding the usage patterns of people. And it's interesting because we as adopters and parents that are so proud of their children and are doing these digital graduations, it's as simple as turning on Teams and sharing this with the world, or either via live stream or with families. and they don't see that the back end in regards to the technology that occurs and how the resources are allocated. That's why, definitely we'll share that out in terms of Mark Razinovich's post on how the resources are allocated and what Microsoft has done to govern over that, to enable everybody to share in terms of the efforts put forth by their grads in graduating university. That brings us to our first news item, Thomas, in regards to how is this all managed and what new features and functionalities were just announced to manage that?
Yeah, so we had a very interesting week, and just yesterday, one of my favorite Azure services got an update, basically the Azure Arc services got a update with that. So when we look at now what we can do, especially when we manage servers, we can now have additional extensions and services available. So let me quickly show you that even, not just a boring blog post this time, but really a live demo, if you will. So here are the servers. These servers are running on-prem in my data center. To be fair, they're running under my desk here. But I connected them using Azure Arc. And now, if you have used Azure Arc before, you can see here we have a couple of new things like extensions. And then also, instead of just policy, we now can see update management, inventory, change tracking, and even log analytics and some other monitoring functionality. So for example, I can now go and click on update management, and I can see the updates needed on that specific machine. And luckily I just patched before, so I don't have any missing updates. But what I could now do, if I would have missing updates, I could directly go and schedule an update deployment and say, hey, during that time I want this server patched, right? I can still do that centralized in update management. But with this solution here, I can actually go out and make sure that, like, for example, a server admin who only has access to that specific server can go and make sure that he has a compliant server installation here. The other interesting part, which I want to show quickly, is the extension part. And this one really is the VM extensions from our Azure VMs. This is basically similar to that, where we take the same extensions and we just put them on Azure Arc machines. So if you want to add an extension, you can see here, this is now a Windows extension or Windows server where we have the Windows extension available. So we can now, for example, directly deploy the Microsoft monitoring agent to that machine. We can use PowerShell desired state configuration or even the custom script extension. So I can go to the Azure portal, log in to Azure Arc, and then run the custom script extension against the server running wherever that server is running, right? If it's under my desk, if it's in my data center, if it's at the store, if it's at another cloud provider, I can basically manage that as it would be an Azure VM. So that is what I'm really excited about this week with Azure Arc.
And I wanted to ask you about that. So it's not just what's been hosted inside of Azure. You also have the ability to manage not only on-premises implementations, but implementations that are in other clouds as well.
Yes, exactly. That's a great point. And that is what often when we talk about hybrid, it's a lot in the mind of people. Okay, hybrid means on-prem in my data center and Azure. But actually with Azure Arc, it doesn't really matter where the on-premise server is running. It can also run, as you said, at another cloud provider. And we are connecting this using an agent. So you install the Azure Arc or the Azure Connected Machine agent on that server. Again, this can be a Windows server or Linux machine. And then this connects over the internet using HTTPS outbound traffic, obviously encrypted, to connect to the Azure APIs, or basically the Azure Arc APIs, if you will. And with that, you get then this integration into Azure Resource Manager, where you can use the Azure management tools.
Now, this is great because it does manage on-premises implementations. Next news story talks about when you have that on-premises implementation and you want to move it to cloud, what do, right? And we're all aware of the Azure assessment tool that's available, or the Azure Migrate tools that are available. But what happens when you run into those situations where you have these machines on a subnet that are not connected outbound? and you need to do an analysis of these machines, but you need to be compliant in terms of ISO standards or specific standards that you have to adhere to. I know there's, in medical and legal and what have you. What do you do to adhere to that? And so our next news story comes in terms of the new availability of using the assessment tool to go forward and analyze an on-premises implementation and on-premises offering and understand the functionality and capabilities, the processes, the ins and outs of the virtual machine or that's on premises, or the if you've got it bare bones on the machine itself, and to export this out as a CSV file. So no longer required to actually have the agent push the information directly, because there are some situations where that cannot occur because of connectivity rules around ISO standards. The tool now allows you to actually export the information as a CSV file and prepare that for assessment later on. It might, in some cases too, require third-party analysis or senior leadership analysis of the information prior to it even going out, right? So there's another ask from the audience in terms of how do I do the assessment without having the agent connect directly to my implementation to extract the data, because my ISO rules won't allow me to do that. And so this tool being announced has been great for legal, for financial institutions, for healthcare that have those privacy policies in place that disallow direct connections to this implementation, but do allow the ability now to export the CSV file of the performance capabilities of the virtual machine to be analyzed later for migration.
Yeah, this is fantastic news, because again, I love Azure Migrate. It helps really, especially the assessment part is just awesome to look at the data you have, or the servers and systems you have, or the applications you have, and then assess them to make sure, okay, what happens if I want to migrate them? Are they even running in Azure? What size of Azure VM do I need? And I remember doing these kind of projects without Azure Migrate, because it didn't exist at this point in time. So I got an Excel spreadsheet, and then I manually mapped the Azure VM sizes and did all the calculations. And with Azure Migrate Assessment, it gets even better, right? It does all the mapping, but as you mentioned, the performance data goes with it. So it does, for example, recommend when your VM on premises is size too large, right? Sometimes you just set a vServer up and give it 4 cores and 8 gigs of memory, and you don't even change it anymore if the VM doesn't even require that much memory or CPU power. And so when you do then an Azure migration, you calculate the actual size usually. But with the Azure Migrate tool, it will recommend you, hey, by the way, you don't even need that large of a VM, so we help you to save certain costs. Yeah.
Well, the beauty of that too is that the assessment tool can then integrate with Azure recommendations in terms of, I see this as your baseline. I see that you've now decreased your usage of this resource, and let's reduce your costs from that perspective as well, right? So it's great because now you have this hard factual baseline that you can also go off, which prior to, like you said, you'd have to do it manually, do an Excel spreadsheet, do the guesswork in terms of which virtual machine, throw that into Azure, and then you have the situation where you might be too much processing power or too little processing power. So it's great that this tool is now made available to offer up that hard baseline for organizations to adopt to when migrating.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, let's continue on.
So speaking of virtual machine sizes, this week was also very excited because we announced a couple of new virtual machine sizes, namely the V4 series, to make it easier, which are our general purpose and memory optimized Azure virtual machines using Intel processors. And we're obviously using some new generation of the Intel Xeon Platinum processors based on the Cascade Lake architecture. And what is interesting is that, again, I mean, this is not just adding a new series of VM with updated CPU power and things like that. We also announced a little bit of a change to make it better for our customers. So we now have the DDV4 and the DDSV4. For example, and the same thing for the E-series VMs, which still have the temporary disk drive, right? like for us who like work for a long time with Azure, there's always a temporary disk drive on our virtual machines, which you can use like for temporary files. I think a lot of applications like SQL can take advantage of that, which is a local disk, which is super fast. But it's only temporary. So when you shut down the virtual machine or the virtual machine crashes, the data on this is gone, which again, if it's just temporary data, it's okay. And so we offer that with these kinds of virtual machines. But as you can see here, we are now offering also now the DV4 and the DSV4, as well as the EV4 and the ESV4 VMs, which do not come with a temporary disk drive. So that for like standard server applications where you don't have any like temporary or an application which cannot take advantage of like a faster temporary disk space, you get a kind of like a cheaper version of that VM, still get all the benefits. Think about it like kind of like as your on-prem VM. And so you get some cost saving there as well. This is currently in preview, so you can try this out and see how that works for you. And again, I think there's also what a lot of people don't know. When we bring out or release a new version of or new VM size, people usually think that this is more expensive than the old one because it's newer CPUs and stuff like that. But in a lot of cases, and again, you can try it out. I'm not saying it's all the time like this, but in a lot of cases, the new versions are even cheaper. Right. So it definitely makes sense that you have a look at the new version and not just use the old versions of these VM sizes.
Now, again, timely in terms of this in conjunction with the announcements made for Azure Arc. I know that this is currently in preview, but then you have this ability now in terms of governance over the optimized memory management for these virtual machines through Azure Arc, possibly in future, right? And for that availability to govern over in terms of utilization.
Yes. So, well, I am not sure if I understood you correctly.
so from the perspective right now, in terms of the management of these optimized virtual machines, right? You can, in essence, do it through Azure Arc currently, right? Even though it's in preview for testing, right? But later on, you can get more. There's a possibility of it becoming more granular in terms of your memory management capabilities.
Yes, absolutely. So yeah, so these versions of these VMs, again, just to be clear here, the standard ones, the DDV4 and the DSV4, they're already generally available. These are like no new things. You can now get full support. It's only about the versions which do not have the temporary disk, the DV4 and the DSV4, for example, and the EV4 and the ESV4 to make it more complex.
I know.
Those are currently in preview, right? But the other ones you can use, they are generally available. You can go out and the region who support these new VM sizes, you can leverage those.
Now, we mentioned back in the day, exporting of data into an Excel spreadsheet in regards to your implementation of server and what have you. Do you remember using Windows Security Baseline when you were doing your deployments of Windows back in the day? I remember doing that in Windows 7, right? It's an important tool that allows us to analyze in terms of our deployment for our end users to have that security baseline to ensure that, best foot forward to for all aspects of security are done from the endpoint measure. Next point of news is Microsoft has now announced Windows 10 baseline update, or update baseline, sorry. And what that does is the ability now to actually manage and control over the functionality of my deployment from a perspective of power, from a perspective of resource utilization, all the aspects outside of security. Prior to were done in a blog post in terms of recommendations that people would follow steps through. Now the Windows 10 team has gone back and said, okay, since we have this Windows 10 security baseline, let's make one now just for general functionality and capability of the resources that are out there. This also takes into consideration low-powered devices. So if you're running Windows 10 on, let's say, a possible a Surface Duo or the Surface Pro X, that uses a lower baseline or lower resource than a traditional PC, you also have the ability to also govern over the baseline utilization in terms of resource and power and what have you. It could be something where if this device is outside of said coverage, go down to this type of connectivity or go down to this type of power schema. You have the ability to really govern over the control of the resources on the device itself and automating a lot of the rules as required.
Yeah, this is again, and if you haven't worked with the baselines, definitely check these out. I know that a lot of companies are really heavily working with these baselines, not just for this scenario, but also like if it comes to security baselines and stuff like that. So yeah, definitely have a look at this because there's, again, as Anthony said, there are like really important stuff in there which help you in these deployments.
So let's continue on with the news. So I gathered there's some events that are happening next week, and I know, Thomas, you wanted to talk about the one.
Yes, so there are two things I want to talk about this for next week. So let me first put this up here. So the first one I really want to talk about is the MC2MC, and I have a lot of letters this week in my news, which is which it's like a soup. Thank you, Pierre. It's like the so this event is by basically a Belgium user group created, and they create an awesome event. It's not just one session or like something like just an hour long. It really is a couple of sessions here, and it is on June 25, where you can join. It's a free online event, so you can join wherever you come from. And there are a couple of sessions around Azure technologies, but also endpoint technologies like on Windows 10 and stuff like that, or even Power Apps and PowerShell automation. So the first session, I'm lucky to be part of this event. And so in the first session, I will talk about hybrid server management. So if you had a look at when I was speaking about server management and the new features in Azure Arc, if you want to know more about that, then you can definitely join that session, and we have a closer look how that works. But again, there's also a lot of other interesting things happening there as well. And the second part I want to quickly highlight is a presentation by Pumla Schmidt, which is part of our team, which is one of our awesome colleagues, also known as Exchange Goddess on Twitter. And she does these awesome live streams called The Current Status, where she talks about different technology topics and has guests in her show to talk about that. And I think she now has Shannon, which also already wrote blog posts on IT Ops Talk, in her show to talk about the latest and greatest, what they do with VMware on Azure, right? As far as I understood. So I'm definitely going to tune in for that one. It's 7 p.m. Eastern time today.
Yep, 7 p.m. Eastern time, North American time. Shannon being on the show is going to be awesome because they will talk about VMware on Azure. Shannon also has awesome posts on IT Ops Talk that talk about creation of DSCs in terms of infrastructure as code in templates that are made available. So great to have her on the show. Pumla actually had Ben Rudolph, Ben the PC guy. Remember him?
Yeah,
way
absolutely.
Back when? Wow, and it was just a fascinating conversation in regards to just adoption of the PCs and what's been happening since human malware struck, and how everybody's gone home, and the whole status of RGB and lights up on the PCs, the disco PCs as I call them, in terms of functionality and capability. So it's a very fascinating show. If you get a chance, again, 7 p.m. Eastern time, look up The Current Status on YouTube, and you'll find the live stream at 7 p.m.
Nice.
So let's continue on. Next up is the Microsoft Learn module of the week. And so this week we decided let's go something, because of the fact we talked a lot about architecture. Here's a great module that'll enable you to get started in terms of the adoption of Azure architecture, network infrastructure inside of Azure. So this is a full-on learning path, which is comprised by multiple modules that are out there. And this gives you the ability to understand networking concepts and connectivity concepts and methods that are available inside of Azure. I love this one because of the fact that a lot of the skills that IT professionals currently have, if they've been managing on-premises implementations for a number of years, it confirms the fact that your skills are very much valid, and an understanding the utilization that's happening of network connectivity inside of Azure your skills are so transferable. It's just confirming that for you. You have that ability to go through and understand, the topologies that are made available, the services that are made available, the security implementations that you can also take advantage of as well in terms of network infrastructure in Azure, taking your experience from on-premises into the cloud, and then going through this. And it's this is a great way to really upskill if you're more of a hands-on individual like myself, as opposed to just reading documentation, and go through the ropes in terms of adoption of network infrastructure inside of Azure.
Yeah, no, and I just want to highlight, because this is actually matches perfectly with where we started our show, where we talked, where we had a quick look at what Mark Rosinovich was telling in his blog and in his presentation he shared earlier on. And network architecture is really an important thing if you move to Azure, if you run workloads in Azure. So this is something, especially if you're an IT pro or an architect, you need to know how you design and architect that solution, right? Building a virtual network takes a couple of seconds. That's not the problem. But actually architecting it in the right way to make sure that it's also ready for the future of your organization, that is critical. And so it's important for you to understand, how do I basically build these networks? How do I lay them out? What is a hub and spoke network topology? How do I do connectivity with my on-prem environment using VPN or ExpressRoute, and all those things which come together? So it's definitely a very important step for people who build and architect solutions in Azure and environments to understand how that works.
I've just been fascinated by the amount of system administrators or operations people that have come to me and just, I took this module and this learning path, and I'm just relieved that all my skills are transferable, right? I don't have to relearn everything. The whole topology piece that you talked about, the hub and spoke implementation. I was deploying that back in the day on ISDN lines at 64K and 128K, and now this availability of doing this all inside of the cloud and utilizing that same topology methodology and enhancing with security attributes. It's just a weight off a lot of IT professionals' shoulders, because the fact that my skills are valid. I can take this, what I've learned and what I know thus far, tweak it a little bit more cloud friendly, and really have that implementation that meets my organization's needs.
Yeah, absolutely. And you need these people, right? That is also a very important part. Obviously, you can use your skills, but you learn new stuff. And as you said, you make it more cloud friendly, which that term I really like. So you can actually take advantage of the cloud, because it's not like just taking then an appliance or anything. There are some really cool cloud native technologies like Azure Firewall and stuff like that, which really grow with your cloud. But not everyone understands this, right? And so I just learned this week again, when I helped out a couple of colleagues which are not networking people. They are basically writing awesome code, they're creating applications, and they now needed to, for example, have access to certain VMs. And so we have some security policies in place also internally, that we can't have public ports open to our internal VMs. And so people reached out to me, oh, can you help me with Azure Bastion? Because I need to create an Azure Bastion subnet, and I get an error. I cannot deploy the Azure Bastion subnet. And then we could figure out, okay, hey, your address space, for example, is not large enough, basically, to have the Azure Bastion subnet. So it's really the subnetting part, which a lot of us IT pros learn very early on, because we need them on-prem as well. And so, as you said, we can adopt this know-how and also use that in Azure. And again, as you said, what this learning module is a lot about is to make it more cloud friendly, to understand our cloud native approach, and so on.
So all the news we reported on today, available online, aka.ms/AZ update news. That will give you a full rundown with all the links that we've shared today in today's broadcast. If you want to follow Producer Pierre, you can do so on Twitter at Wired Canuck. Thomas, you want to share us your details for Twitter?
Yeah, so it's very simple. It's Thomas Maurer on Twitter.
And on Twitter, you can follow me at Wireless Life. It's been a great show. And if you have any other comments, please feel free to add them into the blog post below or into the comment window here. Everybody, have a great weekend, and we'll see you next week.